My wife's lover called me an ATM, then stole from my family. He used me like a bank, humiliated me, and drained my accounts. But when I took him to court, he lost everything. Hi Reddit, I'm Jason, and let me tell you, nothing prepares you for the moment you realize your own family sees you as nothing more than a paycheck. I had always known my family dynamic was a little off, but I never thought they'd straight up humiliate me. I mean, sure, I was the successful one, the one who went to college, built a career in finance, bought a house, and actually planned for the future. I thought that would earn me respect. Instead, it just made me their personal ATM. And no one took advantage of that more than my brother-in-law, Eric. Eric had been a parasite since the day he married my younger sister, Rachel. He never held down a steady job, always had some ridiculous business idea that never went anywhere, and somehow always needed to borrow something from me. My money, my tools, even my vacation home. He'd never return what he took, never paid back a cent, and acted like everything I had was just as much his. For years, I put up with it for Rachel's sake. She had a soft heart, and I didn't want to make things harder for her. But one night, one humiliating, gut-wrenching night at our mother's house, everything changed. We were all gathered for dinner, my mom, Rachel, Eric, and a few cousins. Mom had cooked one of her classic Sunday meals. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a side of asparagus that nobody ever touched. I had just bought a brand new electric car, something I had worked my ass off for, and I was thrilled about it. But, of course, I wasn't the only one interested. At some point during dinner, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car door closing outside. I glanced out the window, and there he was, Eric, lounging in the driver's seat of my car like he owned it, feet on the dashboard, grinning like a damn king. I shot up from my chair. Is Eric seriously in my car right now? I snapped. Before I even made it to the door, he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Relax, man. What's yours is mine, right? You're basically just a walking ATM anyway." And then this is what killed me. Everyone at the table laughed. My mom, my sister, my cousins. They all laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. I stood there, staring at them, my face burning. They didn't realize how pissed I was. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. My mother wiped a tear from her eye, still chuckling. Rachel just shook her head with an amused smile, like this was all perfectly normal. I stormed outside, my fists clenched. "Get out of my car," I said, my voice sharp. Eric, still lounging like he had all the time in the world, smirked. "Relax, bro. It's just a joke." I opened the door, stepping closer. I said, "Get out." For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Maybe realization that I wasn't playing along this time. He raised his hands in mock surrender and slid out, laughing. "Damn, man. You take everything so seriously." I ignored him, brushing past to check the interior. He'd left a smudge on the touchscreen. It shouldn't have pissed me off as much as it did, but it felt like proof. Proof that he had zero respect for me. Back inside, I expected someone, anyone, to call him out. To say, "Hey Eric, that was out of line." Or at least a weak, "Sorry." Instead, my mom sighed, exasperated. "Oh Jason, lighten up. You know how Eric is." I stared at her, at Rachel, at my cousins. That's when it hit me. They didn't respect me. Not really. I wasn't one of them, I was their resource. A bank account with a heartbeat. I stayed silent the rest of the night, pushing food around my plate. I wasn't even hungry anymore. When dinner finally ended, I left without saying much. As I walked to my car, Eric chuckled behind me. "See you later, big guy. Don't spend all our money at once." I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. That night, I lay awake, replaying everything. The laughter, the smugness in Eric's voice, the way my own mother had dismissed my anger like it didn't matter. I had spent years being their provider, the responsible one, the fixer. And what had I gotten in return? Mockery, disrespect. Well, I wasn't going to be their ATM anymore. The moment I left my mother's house, I knew I wasn't coming back. Not like before. Not as their reliable, generous, ever-accommodating Jason. But I wasn't just going to cut them off. I was going to make sure Eric never had the chance to screw me over again. That was when I got a gut feeling. A sick, twisting instinct in my stomach. I opened my banking app. Nothing seemed off at first. But then I checked my credit report, something I hadn't done in months. My heart stopped. There they were. 3 credit cards. Personal loan. All opened in my name. All maxed out. I felt sick. This wasn't some minor mistake. This was deliberate. Someone had used my name, my credit, my reputation, and saddled me with thousands of dollars in debt. And there was only one person in my life shameless enough to pull something like this. Eric. I pulled up my contacts and called my lawyer. He picked up, groggy. Jason? Do you have any idea what time it? I need you to look into something for me. I cut in, my voice cold. Someone's been taking out loans in my name. I want to know exactly what I can do legally. There was a long pause. Then a sigh. That's serious. Send me everything you've got. I'll take a look and call you back. Make it fast, I said before ending the call. By the time I got home, I felt like a different person. The Jason who had tolerated Eric's nonsense, who had swallowed his family's disrespect, who had let things slide for the sake of keeping the peace, that Jason was gone. I wasn't just going to stop Eric. I was going to make sure he paid for every cent he stole. I drove straight to my mother's house, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that Eric had stolen from me or the realization that my own mother had been tied to it. Maybe she hadn't known the full extent of what he was doing. Maybe she had just been manipulated like everyone else. But at this point, I couldn't give her the benefit of the doubt anymore. She opened the door with a surprised smile. Jason, what a nice surprise. I didn't return the smile. We need to talk. Her expression shifted slightly, her smile tightening. About what? I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. Eric has been stealing from me. She blinked. Jason, that's a serious accusation. I have proof. I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. Fraudulent loans. Maxed out credit cards. A bank account that has your name on it. Her face went still. For the first time, I saw a real panic flicker across her features. She opened her mouth like she was going to deny it, but no words came out. Instead, she let out a breath and sat down heavily on the couch. Jason, listen. No, I snapped. You listen. I don't know how deep you're in, but you were either helping him or you let him manipulate you. Either way, I need to hear the truth from you. She rubbed her temples, avoiding my gaze. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me. A long silence. Then, finally, she looked up at me, her eyes tired. Eric told me he was in trouble, she admitted. He said he needed help, that he just needed a little money to get back on his feet. I didn't think it was a big deal. I just wanted to help Rachel. I clenched my jaw. Help Rachel? Or help him? She hesitated. It's the same thing. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. No, it's not. She sighed, rubbing her hands together. He told me you wouldn't help him anymore, that you'd turned your back on family. I didn't want Rachel to suffer because of that. I stared at her in disbelief. So you let him steal from me? She flinched. I didn't think. No, I interrupted. You didn't think. You didn't think about what it would do to me, about what I've already given, about the fact that Eric doesn't need help. He needs consequences. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Jason, I was just trying to keep the family together. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. You didn't keep the family together. You let him tear it apart. Her lip trembled. So, what are you going to do? I pulled my phone out of my pocket, opened my emails and handed it to her. That's the mortgage paperwork you signed. She took the phone with shaking hands. What am I looking at? A second mortgage, I said flatly. Eric took out 50 grand using your house as collateral. If he doesn't pay it back, the bank takes your home. Her fingers tightened around the phone. No, that can't be right. I exhaled slowly. I warned you about him. She looked at me, eyes pleading. Jason, please. I'm pressing charges, I said, cutting her off. Her face drained of color. You can't. I can. And I will. Tears slipped down her cheeks. But I didn't feel anything anymore. Just exhaustion. For years, I had been the one fixing things, keeping everything afloat. And the only thing I had ever gotten in return was betrayal. I turned to leave. Jason, she choked out. What do I do? I paused, hand on the doorknob. Then, without looking back, I said the only thing I could. That's not my problem. I walked out of my mother's house, my heart pounding. Eric had manipulated my family for years, stolen from me, used my mother, laughed in my face. Now I was going to destroy him. I called my lawyer the second I got back to my car. I want to go after him with everything we've got, I said, my voice cold. Fraud, identity theft, forgery. I don't care how long it takes. I want him held accountable. David didn't even hesitate. Then let's burn him to the ground. I sat in my car for a long time after leaving my mother's house, gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached. I had walked in expecting some kind of explanation, maybe even an apology, but all I got was excuses. She had let Eric drag her into this mess, whether willingly or out of sheer blindness. Either way, I couldn't fix it for her. By the time I got home, my anger had settled into something colder, more focused. I wasn't just going to stop Eric, I was going to make sure he never had the chance to do this to anyone again. David called me first thing in the morning. I've already started filing the fraud claims, he said. We're freezing the fraudulent accounts, alerting the credit agencies, and reporting everything to law enforcement. But Jason, he hesitated. You might want to prepare yourself. This could get ugly. I let out a short, bitter laugh. It's already ugly. What I mean is, once Eric realizes what's happening, he's going to panic. People like him don't think they can ever get caught. And when they do, they get desperate. I wasn't worried about what Eric would do. I was worried about how far he had already gone. I spent the rest of the morning locking down my finances, changing every password, freezing my credit. I wasn't leaving any cracks for Eric to slip through. But something still nagged at me. Where had all the stolen money gone? Eric had been siphoning cash from me for years. If he had access to my credit and loans, he should have been drowning in money. But he was always broke, always asking for more. He wasn't spending it on Rachel, she worked full-time as a nurse and covered their household expenses. So where the hell was it going? That's when I called Mila. She had been my rock through all of this. She had seen through Eric long before I had, warned me that my family was using me and never once made me feel like a walking wallet. She answered on the first ring. Jason, she said. What's wrong? I didn't even know where to start. Eric stole more than I thought, I admitted. Loans? Credit cards. And my mom is tied up in it. Mila let out a sharp breath. I knew he was a leech, but this is next level. There's something else, I said, pacing my apartment. If he had access to that much money, why was he always asking for more? Where did it all go? Mila was silent for a moment, then I heard the familiar sound of her typing on a keyboard. Give me an hour, she said. I have a theory. I trusted Mila more than I trusted anyone. So when she called me back exactly an hour later, I braced myself. Jason, she said, her voice tense. I found it. I sat up straight. Found what? Your vacation house, she said. I frowned. What about it? You told me you don't rent it out, right? Of course not. Why? Because someone is. My stomach dropped. What? There's a listing, she said. It's under some fake rental company, but the pictures? They're from inside your house. Same furniture. Same decor. Eric's been renting it out behind your back. I pulled my phone away from my ear and stared at it like it had personally betrayed me. Then I opened my laptop, pulled up the link Mila sent, and felt my blood turn to ice. There it was. My house. He had been running a short-term rental business using my property, collecting thousands in bookings while I was completely unaware. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. That son of a, I cut myself off, shaking with anger. It gets worse, Mila said grimly. I looked at the reviews. Some of them mentioned the owner, as in Eric. He's been meeting guests in person, pretending it's his. The sheer audacity of it made me want to punch something. He had stolen from me, laughed in my face, and now he was profiting off something I had worked for. And he thought I wouldn't find out? Jason, Mila said carefully. What are you going to do? I took a slow breath, forcing myself to think. I'm shutting it down, I said. Every fraudulent booking, every dollar he scammed, I'm taking it back. And then I'm going after him for everything. Mila exhaled. Good. Because I don't think he's done yet. She was right. Eric wasn't done. And when I found out what else he had been hiding, it was going to be the final straw. I drove straight to my vacation house, my pulse hammering the entire way. Every mile felt like another layer of betrayal sinking deeper into my chest. I had always thought of the house as my escape, a quiet place I could go to when I needed a break from work, from family, from everything. But Eric had turned it into his personal business. When I pulled into the driveway, I expected to find the place empty. Instead, a car I didn't recognize was parked outside. My stomach twisted. I climbed out, jaw tight, and walked up to the door. Before I could even knock, it swung open. A couple stood in the entryway, looking confused. The woman clutched a small rolling suitcase, and the man frowned at me. "Can we help you?" "Who are you?" I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer. The man gave me a wary look. "We booked this place for the weekend. Are you the host?" I took a slow breath, forcing my hands to unclench. "No," I said. "I own this house." The woman's face fell. "Wait, what? You booked this through a rental site?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, we've been coming here for a few months now. The guy who runs it, Eric, I think? He told us this was his property." I closed my eyes for a second, my anger hitting a boiling point. He had been doing this for months. Not just stealing from me, actively pretending to own something I had worked for. "I'm really sorry," I told them, trying to keep my voice level. "But you've been scammed. Eric doesn't own this place. He's been illegally renting it out." Their expressions darkened with realization. "Are you serious?" the man muttered. "We paid him up front for the next 2 weekends." I shook my head. "You need to file a complaint with the site. And I suggest calling your bank to dispute the charges. But I have to shut this down now." They didn't argue. They grabbed their bags and left, muttering angrily as they climbed into their car. I watched them pull away before stepping inside. The second I walked through the door, I knew Eric had been here recently. Dirty dishes sat in the sink. There were beer cans on the coffee table and unfamiliar jacket thrown over one of the chairs. The worst part? My personal things, photographs, books, even some of my clothes, were missing. Like he had deliberately erased any sign that I had ever lived here. I stormed into the bedroom, yanked open the closet, and felt a fresh wave of rage. Eric's clothes. His damn sneakers. Even a cheap bottle of cologne sitting on my dresser. He had been living here. Not just running a scam, he had been using my house as his personal crash pad, probably bringing in guests while he pocketed the cash. I grabbed my phone and called David. "I need you to file trespassing charges," I said the moment he picked up. David didn't sound surprised. "I take it you found something?" "He's been living in my house," I gritted out. "Pretending he owns it. Renting it out for months. I just kicked out a couple who thought they had booked a vacation stay." David let out a low whistle. "That's next-level scumbag behavior. Do you want to press additional charges?" "Every single one I can," I said without hesitation. "All right," David said. "But listen, Jason, if he's been using your place as his own, there's a good chance he's hiding more than just guests. Have you checked your financials again? I wouldn't be surprised if this is just the tip of the iceberg." I clenched my jaw. "I'll check. But first, I'm making sure he never steps foot here again." After hanging up, I spent the next hour packing up every single thing that didn't belong to me. I threw his clothes into garbage bags, tossed out his toiletries, and made damn sure there wasn't a single trace of him left in my house. Then I changed the locks. By the time I was done, I was still shaking with anger. Eric thought he could steal from me and get away with it. He thought he could use me, erase me, and that I wouldn't fight back. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. I drove back home with a storm raging in my chest. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly I could feel the tension in my knuckles, but nothing compared to the fury boiling inside me. Eric hadn't just stolen money. He hadn't just opened credit cards in my name. He had taken my home, my sanctuary, and paraded around like it was his. He had erased me from my own property, turned it into a business, and filled his pockets with money that should have never been his in the first place. The moment I walked into my apartment, I went straight to my laptop. David was right, I needed to check my finances again. If Eric had the audacity to do this, there was no telling how deep his greed ran. I logged into my bank accounts, scanning transactions with a level of scrutiny I had never used before. At first, it seemed normal. My balances were what I expected. No major withdrawals. No sudden missing funds. But then I checked my investment accounts. And my stomach dropped. A transfer of $15,000 had been pulled from my brokerage account 6 months ago, money I hadn't touched. I scrolled further, my pulse pounding. 2 months after that, another $8,000 was withdrawn. Then another $12,000. My head spun. I had assumed Eric was taking money from my credit cards, but he had gone deeper. He had stolen from my investments. I sat back in my chair, gripping the edge of my desk as realization sank in. That money was supposed to be untouchable, growing in the background for my future. And yet Eric had somehow found a way in. I clicked the details of the transactions, searching for where the money had gone. The recipient account was one I didn't recognize, but it was linked to a business name. A business I had never heard of before. I copied the name and started searching online, my fingers flying over the keyboard. And then, after a few minutes of digging, I found it. A bar. A rundown, barely functioning bar in the city under the name Eric's Taproom. My blood turned to ice. Eric hadn't just been stealing to fund his own lazy lifestyle. He had been using my money to bankroll a business. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering. A business required permits, leases, utilities, something in those records would tie back to him. I could bury him in legal trouble with this alone. I grabbed my phone and called David. "Jason," he answered. "Tell me you have more bad news." "Oh, it's worse than bad," I said, my voice sharp. "Eric didn't just steal from me. He used my investment account to fund a business. A bar." David let out a low whistle. "You're kidding." "I wish I was. It's in his name, but the money? That was mine." "All right," David said. "We'll hit him with financial fraud, but now we're looking at business fraud too. If he used stolen money to start it, we might be able to get the place seized." "Have you gone down there yet?" "No," I said. "But I'm about to." David hesitated. "Jason, be careful. Guys like Eric, when they feel trapped, they do stupid things." "He's already done stupid things," I said coldly. "And I'm about to make him regret every single one of them." I hung up, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door. Eric had built a life out of my money. It was time to tear it all down. The drive to Eric's so-called business felt like a countdown to war. Every red light, every slow driver, every second wasted on the road only fueled the fire in my chest. He had taken my money, my home, my dignity, and turned them into his personal playground. Not anymore. I pulled up in front of Eric's taproom, and if I hadn't been seething with rage, I might have laughed at how pathetic it looked. The bar was nothing special, run-down, dimly lit, with a faded sign hanging lopsided above the entrance. A couple of drunk regulars loitered outside, smoking and talking loudly, completely oblivious to the storm about to hit. I pushed through the doors, stepping inside. The place smelled like stale beer and desperation. A few patrons sat at the bar, hunched over their drinks, while a bartender wiped down the counter with half-hearted effort. And standing at the far end, laughing with someone like he didn't have a single care in the world, was Eric. He didn't see me at first. I took my time walking over, every step deliberate, my fists clenched at my sides. Then finally his eyes landed on me. For a split second I saw it. That flicker of recognition. The moment he realized I wasn't here to have a friendly drink. His smile faltered. "Jason." I didn't stop until I was standing right in front of him. "We need to talk." His gaze darted around like he was debating whether to act casual or take off running. "Listen, man, if this is about..." I grabbed a napkin off the bar, pulled a pen from my pocket, and started writing. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice low and controlled. "You're going to sign this place over to me. Right now." Eric's eyes widened. "What?" "You heard me," I said, shoving the napkin toward him. "You funded this place with my money. Which means, legally, it's mine. You can either hand it over voluntarily, or I can take you to court and have it seized." His face turned red. "You can't just..." "I can," I cut him off. "And I will. You think I haven't been preparing for this? Fraud. Identity theft. Financial manipulation. Your name is all over it. You're looking at a full-blown criminal case, Eric." He swallowed hard. "Look, man, sign it," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Or I swear to God, I'll make sure you don't just lose this place, you'll lose everything." For a moment, he just stood there, his breathing uneven, his hands twitching like he wanted to throw a punch but knew he'd lose. Then finally, with the weight of reality crashing down on him, he grabbed the pen. His signature was shaky, but it was there. I took the napkin, folded it neatly, and put it in my pocket. "Now get out," I said. "And don't ever take anything from me again." Eric didn't argue. He just stared at me, defeated, before grabbing his coat and storming out of the bar. I let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders loosen for the first time in weeks. One step closer. Eric had spent years building his life off my back. Now I was taking it all back. I stood in the middle of my bar, watching the door swing shut behind Eric. For years he had taken from me money, property, respect, and walked away without consequences. But this time I had taken something from him. And it was only the beginning. The bartender, a lanky guy in his late 20s with tired eyes, glanced at me warily. "So, what just happened?" I just became your new boss, I said, slipping the napkin with Eric's shaky signature into my pocket. I assume he never told you where the money to open this place came from? The guy snorted. Hell no. He made it sound like he was some kind of genius investor. I smirked. Figures. I took a slow look around the bar, taking in the peeling paint, the wobbly chairs, the cheap liquor bottles lining the shelves. Eric had taken thousands from me and this was what he had to show for it? A dump barely holding itself together? It was almost insulting. I wasn't planning to keep the place. I didn't want it. But before I decided what to do with it, I needed to make sure Eric didn't have one single piece of my life left under his control. I walked behind the counter, opening the register. It was nearly empty. No surprise there, Eric had probably been bleeding this place dry, just like he did with everything else. Then I spotted a small safe tucked under the bar. I crouched down, testing the lock. It was cheap. Too cheap. Does the safe belong to him? I asked the bartender. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. He always made a big deal about keeping the cash locked up. I grabbed a screwdriver from behind the counter, wedged it into the weak lock, and snapped it open with one hard twist. The bartender took a step back. Inside, there was no cash. No receipts. Just a thick, crumpled folder. I pulled it out, flipping it open. And that's when I really saw just how deep Eric's lies ran. Fake bank statements. Forged business documents. A contract for a loan under someone else's name. My mother's name. The room blurred around me as I processed what I was looking at. Eric had used my mother as collateral. I flipped through the papers, my heart hammering. She wasn't just tangled in his mess, she was drowning in it. The bartender shifted awkwardly. Should I be here for this? No, I muttered, shoving the folder under my arm. Go home. The bar's closed. Without another word, I walked out. I had thought I was done with Eric. I had no idea just how much damage he had left behind. I drove to my mother's house, gripping the folder so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Every page inside felt heavier than the last. Eric hadn't just stolen from me, he had dragged my mother into this deeper than I could have imagined. When I pulled up, the house looked the same as always, but it felt different now. Like a crime scene. I knocked, and after a few moments, she opened the door. Her face was tired, her eyes red, like she hadn't slept. Jason, she said cautiously. What's wrong? I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. I found this, I said, dropping the folder onto the kitchen table. She looked down at it, hesitant, then slowly flipped it open. I watched as her expression shifted from confusion to horror. Her voice trembled. What is this? Eric took out a loan, I said, my tone sharp. In your name. She shook her head rapidly. No, that's not possible. I never. He forged your signature, I cut in. He used you as collateral, Mom. If he doesn't pay it back, they're coming after you. Her hands started to shake as she turned the pages. Oh my God, she whispered. How much? 75,000, I said coldly. She gasped, her fingers flying to her mouth. No, he told me he just needed a little help. He said it was just a small loan. I slammed my hand on the table. Mom, he lied? He always lies. Tears welled in her eyes. I thought he just needed time. I didn't know he did this. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay calm. We can fix it, I said. But you need to stop protecting him. No more excuses. She nodded weakly, her whole body trembling. What do I do? I pulled out my phone and handed it to her. Call the bank. Right now. Tell them it was fraud. Tell them you never signed anything. She hesitated, staring at the phone like it was a loaded weapon. Mom, I said, my voice softer now. You have to do this. If you don't, you'll lose everything. Finally, with a shaky breath, she dialed. I listened as she spoke to the bank, her voice breaking as she explained the situation. When she hung up, she looked at me, defeated. They're opening an investigation. Good, I said. Now there's just one thing left. She swallowed. What? We go to the police. Her face crumpled. Jason, he's my son-in-law. And he's a criminal, I said firmly. You don't have a choice anymore. She wiped at her tears, then nodded. Okay. I pulled out my keys. Let's go. For years, my mother had turned a blind eye to Eric's behavior. But now, with everything laid bare in front of her, she finally saw the truth. And for the first time, she was choosing to stand with me. The drive to the police station was quiet. My mother sat in the passenger seat, gripping her hands together so tightly her knuckles turned white. I could feel the tension radiating off her, the shame, the disbelief, the weight of everything finally settling onto her shoulders. She had spent years defending Eric, brushing off his behavior, believing his lies. Now, she was about to walk into a police station and report him for fraud. When we arrived, I parked and turned to her. Are you sure you're ready for this? She inhaled shakily. No. But I don't have a choice, do I? I nodded. No, you don't. We stepped inside, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a dull, clinical glow. A tired-looking officer sat behind the front desk. When we approached, he barely glanced up. How can I help you? I set the folder on the counter. We need to report financial fraud. Identity theft. Forgery. That got his attention. He straightened, looking between me and my mother. Who's the suspect? My mother's voice was barely above a whisper. Eric. Eric Porter. My son-in-law. The officer studied us for a moment, then gestured for us to follow him. He led us to a small room in the back where another officer took our statements. I went first, detailing how Eric had stolen my identity, taken out fraudulent loans, and even used my vacation home as an illegal rental. Then it was my mother's turn. She hesitated, her hands trembling in her lap. I didn't know what he was doing, she said. I trusted him. I thought he was struggling, that he just needed help. But he used me. He forged my name. He put my home at risk. The officer took notes, nodding occasionally. We'll need to investigate the financial records, he said. If the signatures don't match, that strengthens your case. Do you have any proof he was the one who filed the loan? I opened the folder, flipping to the forged contract. This is his writing, I said. I've seen it 1,000 times. The officer took it, examining it closely. This is bad, he admitted. With everything you've shown us, it's enough to open a full investigation. My mother closed her eyes, like the words physically hurt her. What happens now? I asked. We'll issue a warrant for his arrest, the officer said. If we can prove the fraud, he could be facing serious charges. Minimum 5 years. I glanced at my mother, expecting her to waver. Instead, she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and nodded. Do what you have to do, she said. For the first time in my life, I saw it. She wasn't protecting Eric anymore. She was choosing to protect herself. And me. As we walked out of the police station, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The weight on my chest had lifted. The years of being used, disrespected, and mocked were finally over. Eric had spent his life taking from me. Now, it was time for him to lose everything. 2 days after filing the police report, Eric was arrested. I got the call from David early in the morning. It's done, he said. They picked him up at his apartment last night. He didn't even see it coming. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words sink in. Eric was finally facing consequences. What's next? I asked. They're charging him with multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and identity theft. Since the amounts are so high, he's looking at a felony case. He'll have a court date soon, but Jason, he's screwed. I exhaled a slow, satisfied breath. Good. That afternoon, Rachel called me. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. The moment I picked up, she burst into tears. Jason, they took him. I said nothing. She sniffled, her voice shaking. How could you do this? He's my husband. He's a criminal, I corrected. He stole from me. From Mom. From half the family. Rachel let out a sharp breath. I didn't know. Yes, you did, I cut in. You knew who he was. Maybe not all the details, but you knew. And you defended him anyway. She went silent. Finally, she whispered, what am I supposed to do now? I almost felt sorry for her. Almost? You start over, I said simply. Without him. A month later, Eric stood in court, facing everything he had tried to run from. The evidence was overwhelming. The fraudulent accounts, the stolen money, the fake business documents, it all painted a clear picture of a man who had spent years conning his way through life. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison. I sat in the courtroom watching as he was led away in handcuffs. He didn't look at me. Didn't look at Rachel. Didn't look at my mother. He had nothing left. And I felt nothing for him. When it was all over, I walked out of that courthouse a free man. Not just free from Eric's theft, but free from the weight of my family's expectations. For years, I had been their provider. Their problem solver. Their walking ATM. But that Jason? He was gone. Mila and I spent the next year rebuilding. We renovated the vacation house, the one Eric had stolen from me, and turned it into our own getaway. A place that was finally mine again. And on a quiet evening, standing on the deck overlooking the lake, I got down on one knee and asked her to marry me. She said yes. A year later, we got married in that same house. No family. No mother who had betrayed me. No sister who had refused to see the truth. No cousins who had laughed at my humiliation. Just the people who truly cared. The ones who had proven themselves. As I stood there, looking at the life I had built, the life I had reclaimed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Eric was gone. My past was behind me. And for the first time in my life, I belonged to myself.